Hello to everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to another Soup with Directors, our everyday talk at the 17th International Human Rights Documentary Film Festival, DocuDays UA. Just to remind you, I think everyone knows it already, that it's first ever festival in the history of DocuDays UA, which is online. And we are testing new formats due to needs of lockdown. And Soup with Directors is our everyday program when we talk to directors of the films presented this year. And every talk has its own topic, rather broadly defined. And today we are going to discuss topics of discipline, punishment, and freedom. At least this is how the topic is shaped. Discipline and punish, the birth of freedom. The notion of prison, of incarceration, seems to be rather ironic nowadays, as one can read in the talk description, because a lot of people now stay indoors, have to stay indoors due to pandemic situation. But of course, I would say that I don't want to be rather insensitive comparing this situation to situation in actual prisons. This is still very different. And when someone happens to find him or herself behind bars, people really experience for the first time, people really experience something they've never experienced before, when their freedom is restricted both physically, emotionally, psychologically, and morally. But as some argue, this is where the starting point for liberty actually might lie. And today I'm happy to welcome directors of films The Cause, Andrés, hello. Film Eye to Eye, John with us online. And film Inside Outside, Alice and Charlotte with us today. Hi.
Hi.
It's so nice you could join us today, and it's such a shame we could not physically invite you to Kiev, as we quite often do. Hopefully one of next years it will become possible, but at least nowadays we can have this talk, vast subject and limited time, 1 hour only. And all your films are in one way or another related to prison, to people who are in prison, who are serving time, and for those who are outside and can communicate with them in very different roles. And my first question probably would go to Andrés. Your film, The Cause, actually, as far as I can understand from discussions with my colleagues, provoked uproar among the audience. It is shocking, it is revealing, it is extremely interesting. The first question actually I have is quite technical. The Cause was translated into Ukrainian as a word which has multiple meanings, but I'm afraid one specific meaning somehow eluded it. Is the cause something like a jargon term, something like common deed, and something like common fund as well, which prisoners collect money to for their own needs?
Yeah, so the name that was it's in Spanish. It also has la causa also has different meanings, and that's the reason I think for that we use the title. One of the meanings is what you said. The cause is this taxation system. So for those who saw the film, what's really interesting or weird or dystopic about the Venezuelan prison system is that for several years now, prisoners have been in control of many of the prisons in the country. So they took over the control because of corruption, because of negligence. They took over the control of the prison compounds, and so essentially created parallel criminal states in which inmates have their own rule of law. And the cause, what they call la causa, is the tax system that they levy on the prison population that follows these rules. So not everybody pays the cause, But if you do pay the cause, you have like you're like a citizen of the prison. If you don't pay, then you're a lower citizen. You're like part of the workforce, and you help clean the prisons, or you cook the food for the thugs, or you do it like so. The cause is that, but it's also cause and consequence. No, like the cause for a lot of the issues that Venezuela is facing through right now is that we have an upside down world in which criminals have weapons inside the prisons and they're making their own rules. And then also the third meaning of the cause is when you're together in a crime with a person and you fall guilty in Venezuela, you say mi causa, like my cause is the person who's on the same crime with me. So it has those three meanings. But the main one is this interesting tax system that the kingpin, or the PRAN, P-R-A-N, levies on the population, and they use that to run the prison, but also to buy the weapons, and it's essentially a tax system that this parallel state controls.
Quite difficult task for translators, actually, to translate it properly into Ukrainian, but on the other hand, I should say it sounds pretty similar to some jargon terms related to prison system in Ukraine or in former Soviet Union. We also have this word общак, like common fund, where people in prison should pay, and this is so-called taxation system. There are some other striking similarities. The same sort of caste system inside the prison, where there are outcasts and there are those who cannot even be touched, like people on the roof in your film, homosexuals, and there are professional criminals, and there are all these others, and you show them from quite close distance, all of them you filmed through years, and of course I couldn't help myself but to ask, how did you manage to get such a close access to these people? How did they let you film them? Was it difficult?
It was very difficult. So it took me, I started doing this film when I was 18. I'm 28 now. I finished it in November of last year, but it took me the first, I would say like the first 3 or 4 years was being able to get the inmates to trust me, to understand that I wasn't there for like quick journalism reporting, but I really wanted to do an in-depth understanding of our Venezuelan prison system. And obviously, to get into that level of trust, you have to be approved by the gang members and the kingpins and stuff like that. So I think one thing that's important, and I'm pretty sure this is the same everywhere in the world, where criminals have this code of conduct that if you give your word, that's what matters. Like if you say, look, this is what I'm going to do, and you don't have ulterior motives, and you're being real and genuine, and they say, okay, you can do this, but then there's certain restrictions that were placed on me, obviously. And I was allowed to, throughout the years, be able to get more and more access, because we would take, like basketball teams, baseball teams, soccer teams, and they started getting used to seeing me with a camera around. So, and they knew that nothing was like I wasn't, obviously the first concern that an inmate in that world would have is he an intelligence officer? Is he in the police force? But then little by little, they started realizing that my motives were the ones that I had said at the beginning, and I would bring concerts to the prison. That's where if you see the film, the hip hop artists, we even built a music studio inside the prison, because we realized there was so much talent that was going to waste, that we had to do something to give back, to the community there. And we built a music studio, and we made a hip hop album inside the prison. That's like a spin-off of this documentary, but it was really interesting to see, to create like this little oasis inside this world, where inside the studio we had rules. We had, you couldn't smoke weed inside the studio. You had to use shirts inside. So we kind of started building this new sense of community around this music studio, and it helped us a lot, to get the trust of the inmates who were there. It was hard at first, and obviously, like me going into this prisons, I'm a white Venezuelan, tall, like I look very different from the average prisoner. So it was like, there was no going, underneath the radar. So you had to be able to convince people and to rally them around, some sort of understanding of what we were doing. And a lot of them saw positive things as like, these people that are not part of the government, they're not social workers, and they're coming here to help us in a sector of society that nobody ever looks at, Like nobody cares about Venezuelan prisons. That's why they got to the level of where they are now. And so we use this studio space to start raising awareness, and I think that was the main thing. You know, we were going in with good deeds, and that allowed us to continue to film there.
And before switching to Alice and Charlotte, I really have to ask you next question. You've already mentioned, or actually you touched upon. You know, there is this one of the main characters in your film, former convict, former prisoner who became member of the parliament. And you've already mentioned that the prison system in Venezuela in a way reflects an overall situation in the country. What does Venezuelan prison system, and specifically the striking thing that some of the prisons are effectively taken over by criminals, what does it say about the country from your point of view?
Well, I think Venezuela is going through a very bad government system. You know, like being able that shows how much control the government has lost over the population. And, you know, essentially it's a mandate in the constitution that the government should be the one responsible of the prison system. And, you know, having essentially parallel states within your own state where criminals get put into jail for crimes that are very similar to the ones that they keep committing inside the prison, it shows that there's so much moral corruption within the military forces that allow, you know, the guns to go into the prisons. These are the National Guard who guard the prisons on the outside, and they're the ones who let these weapons in, and, you know, people turn a blind eye. So I think a lot of this reflects, you know, if our prisons are so armed, imagine how much, you know, the population outside of prisons is armed. And that's one of the main problems in Venezuela. We've seen so much rise in criminality and all of these things because a lot of the weapons that, as they say at the beginning of the film, the guy who traffics the weapons inside the prisons, he says these are weapons who were once in the hands of the police and now they're in the hands of criminals. So obviously to have a state in which this happens is a state that's beginning to fail. Like there's a lot of issues in terms of what's going on in Venezuela, but the prisons are hubs of criminality in which, you know, kidnappings come from there, gold trafficking, arms trafficking, narcotics trafficking happen from there. And I think, you know, having these essentially military bunkers, criminals, you know, it's causing a lot of harm, and it's something that the state needs to solve as soon as possible, because if not, then we're going to have many more criminals. You know, you get thrown into a prison as a thief, and you're next to murderers, kidnappers, everything. There's no crime classification. So obviously that's going to create, you know, just because of survival instincts, people are going to get worse in our prisons instead of, you know, being centers for rehabilitation for petty crimes.
Thank you. I'm from time to time having a look at my phone. It's not because I'm disinterested. It's just because this is the gadget I am receiving comments and questions from members of our audience too. So I'm just checking live whether we have some questions. We already have, actually. But first, I would like to carry on with the same question in different context, addressing prison system and society as a whole. And this is a question to Alice and Charlotte. Your film is a short film describing people who keep human touch with prisoners by writing them letters, and we'll touch upon that a bit later. But at the end of it, we have subtitles which, in a critical way, describe situation in French penitentiary system, in terms of numbers, but also in terms of exercising effectively the authority to interrupt, disrupt, intervene into this communication by letters when it comes to prisoners and the outside world. And it looks like French system, contrary to Venezuelan one, is pretty much well controlled by the state authorities, and it's a different kind of control and different kind of intervention, also in a way similar to Ukrainian experience. In your opinion, what do you think French penitentiary system and French prisons, in those aspects you film is about, what does it say about French society at the current moment?
Well, actually, I was exactly thinking about that when you were talking, Andrés, because it's exactly the opposite in France. Actually, the state has this very repressive and way of looking at prison system, but also they really want to be the only one to keep it, and like they don't let enter NGOs or associations. Well, not anymore, at least. And but at the same time, they don't offer like new ways of keeping the prisoners busy like the associations used to, or they don't provide like more material, more computers or whatever. So I don't know if inside the prison they have more control than in the rest of European countries, but at least they really have this goal of being the only one in charge in the prison. And it shows that I think the French example shows that if there is only the state that is in charge of prison, and if the state doesn't rely on like public activists or people who have like another point of view about the prison system that only a legal point of view, it only can be a repressive way of managing the prison. And in that respect, France is like one of the worst carceral system in Europe, and has like many the Court of European Justice and of Human Rights is really against like French way of management of prison. And I think it says that in France the state has a lot of difficulty to share the management of many parts of the society, and prison is of course one of them.
And question to follow is related to really current situation, you know, in Ukrainian penitentiary system as well as in other countries. Some things changed since the beginning of pandemic and lockdown. Access to prisoners became more difficult, but also some of prisons actually are risking to become some sort of petri pot for infection and for virus. So this is why Ukraine, a bit too late, but still is going to release some prisoners on amnesty. On the other hand, we have Ukrainian human rights organizations making statements criticizing the transparency of information regarding virus in prisons. We know that there are cases of people being sick with COVID-19 in Ukrainian penitentiary system, but officially authorities are quite reluctant to talk about it. Were there any changes in French penitentiary system, if you are following it right now after you completed your film?
Well, actually, it is the same. Maybe Charlotte, you wanna?
Yeah, we don't have a lot of information neither. It begins to be a topic in France, sorry, but we don't know a lot about it, and there haven't been a lot of articles written on the subject, or so it's quite blur. We can't really know, but we just can assume that it must be a problem.
Actually, they have also released some of the prisoners, like petty criminals, in order to make space, because it is the main problem in France. It's that prisons are overcrowded. And now they released like 1/4 of the petty criminals, and it is like a 100%. The prison is like full. And it used to be like twice the number it could get. So it's a bit better, but like still very preoccupying. And there are many cases, but we don't know the gravity. Many of the prisoners, I think it's the same everywhere, have already like bad health, disease, like you don't have a good health routine in prison. And I know that through letters which is the only last way to communicate with prisoners, especially from the families. Even the letters, they started to shut down because they are afraid that the virus will stay on the paper.
Oh.
So it's again like one more shutting down.
It's another channel of communication being closed, and an essential one. And I was going to ask about that. Your film depicts a person or a group of persons who write letters to prisoners whom they don't know personally, and keep regular communication with them to provide some sort of window to the outside world and human touch. In a way, you know, in Ukraine now and in last few years, there are quite a lot of people who write letters to prisoners. In the first place, it is about Ukrainian political prisoners being held in Russia. And this practice of sending letters is more and more widespread, but also some people asked us when we were busy with this, what should I write about? I don't know this person. Are there any rules? Are there any things to keep in mind? And your film actually answers some of these questions. But I was wondering, who are these people who write letters? Is it a person like your main protagonist? Is it a collective? Do they have certain background which motivated them, or they just at some point in time decided to do that out of the blue?
It's exactly the question we ask ourselves to begin this film. Who are these people who write letters? And what we what we noticed is that there is mainly women. First of all, it's a lot of women, like 3/4. 75%, and it's people who go to there is one main association in France that gathers people who want to communicate with inmates, and it's called Le Courrier de Beauvais, and this association has rules, but there are no rules for themselves between inmates and people who write letters. It's more the association who decided to set some rules. And one of the main rule is not to give your identity. So you have another name and you have to hide your last name, but you can present yourself with your name to prisoners, and then you can discuss what you want. Just another rule is that you don't ask why the person is in prison. That's the rule. But other than that, it's about discussion. It's about giving the inmate the opportunity to express himself or herself. And so our character, she's an old lady, 80 years old, and she told us that it's better not to ask too many questions, because it can be a bit oppressive. So just give some ways, some subjects, open subject, and then the discussion can go on.
Mm-hmm. Most of these.
And about.
Yep.
No, just to finish with the kind of people who write letters. So I said that it was just most of them were women, but also there is young people, there is more older people, but it may be more people in pension. The fact was that there were more people, a bit more old people than young. But it's quite diverse, and reason are diverse too.
Mm-hmm. And you also have another person whose voice we can hear, and she describes her experiences of sending letters from inside the prison. How did you manage to get that part of narrative?
we contacted French, like the International Observatory of Prisoners, and through this, the contacts we had there, they gave us some names of people, of women, because we wanted to have a women point of view inside the prison, because it's quite rare, and so they gave us some contacts, and through these contacts we addressed question and one special woman, the one that we hear in the documentary, and she wanted to be part of the film, but because of the operation, she sorry for my English, she received in her life. She didn't want it to appear in the film or to be recognized. She couldn't really trust us neither. She couldn't be sure we weren't journalists or people from the administration. So she decided not to meet us, and we just discussed through recorded conversations through phones. So what we hear in the film are the results of those recordings.
And those rules you've mentioned, actually most of them really apply in Ukraine, probably apart from the first rule. Here, people who write letters, who send letters, they are obliged to provide their real name. Otherwise, I mean, it should be mentioned on the envelope. Otherwise, the communication back and forth is not feasible. But all the other things are important, really. And you know, Ukrainian political prisoners who were released from Russian prisons last year, they all mentioned how important letter writing and communication by letters is inside prisons. One of them, Oleg Sentsov, is happily on the jury, is a jury member of our this year's festival, and him and few human rights organizations actually invited all our audience members to sign petition, which is at the change.org website, and you can find link to it on Facebook of the festival on the website, for the release of remaining Ukrainian political prisoners in Russian prisons, especially in the context of COVID-19. So you can find the link, just spend a few minutes and put your signature there. It's not difficult. And just yesterday I've contacted one of the former Ukrainian political prisoners, an anarchist from Crimea, Alexander Kolchenko, who's also been released last September. And in our online conversation, he reminded me of his own quote. I asked him about it, how much letters, how much they matter to the prisoners. Just to quote him, letters for prisoners are extremely important. In the first place, it is a moral support. It is a sign that nothing is in vain and you are not alone. Second, it's an opportunity to widen communication circle, find out about news from the other side of the fence. And the third point is that the flow of correspondence is also a sign to administration of the prison, that with this prisoner, if you push upon him, you press him too much, there might be a problem. And also through the letter writing and communication, I was able to meet so many people, Alexander said, and with some of them I was happy to see them after I went out of prison, and we are friends now. So this letter writing is as important when we talk about prisoners, political prisoners and other prisoners, both in France and in Ukraine, and it is also a very human thing to do, and it is also a very human film which talks about it, your film, Alice and Charlotte. And I would like to continue with another human aspect of penitentiary system, and this is a question which goes to John. John Webster's film Eye to Eye deals with very difficult side of prison system of penitentiary and punishment, you show relatives and loved ones of people being killed who meet perpetrators of those murders and try to find some sort of common communication ground with them. And it seems to be striking and extremely difficult at times. What was your impression? Is it psychologically possible for any person to do that? Or you need to be some very special sort of person to be able to talk to the murderer of your loved one?
Yeah, well, this is at the center of the film it's a form of trauma therapy, which is based on restorative justice. Yeah, and the idea is that under certain conditions, it can be helpful for the families of murder victims to meet the perpetrators, and the families of murder victims have like very special circumstances in that for them, usually the process of sorrow gets postponed sometimes indefinitely. And if you think of, I mean, all of us have experienced loss in some form. It can be, milder forms than losing somebody through violence. It can be like losing a relationship, or it can be losing a job or a friendship. And usually what people do is we mourn, we have a period of sorrow. And when somebody dies under natural or even through an accident, usually when after the funeral has done, this period of sorrow begins. But for the families, and this is everywhere in the world, for the families of murder victims, first there's the police inquiry, then there's the first stage of court, and then there's a little bit of brief of peace, and then there's the next. So sometimes it takes 4 or 5 years until the sentence for the murderer is finalized. And only then do they have peace to start the sorrow process, and many people have learned to live without it. So in this form of therapy is that it's a way to unlock some of the things that are keeping the family members from starting the sorrow. Sometimes it can be questions that they want to know about the death of their loved ones, or it can be to understand why. That's a very important question, why their loved one died. And so if they have these questions that don't give them peace, sometimes it can be good for them to meet the murderers. Mm-hmm. But the number one requirement is that the murderer should want to ask for forgiveness and mm-hmm. really truly regret what they did. And so before this meeting can happen, there are a lot of interviews that are made by professionals with the family members and also the murderers.
So you've just described why family members might need that. But apart from moral regrets, what's in that for the prisoners, for the perpetrators? Do they have any other motives to take part in this restorative therapy, from purely material probably to psychological ones?
Well, there's no material advantage for them to take part, and there's no, if they take part, they don't get special treatment in the prisons or anything like that. So it is from a truly personal reason they want, and many of the people who do take part is they've been in prison. Some of them that I met are getting quite close to being released, and they do want to have a better chance of a life without crime after they leave the prison. And for certainly the people who are in my film, they think that by taking what's happened. Can you hear me,
yeah, I'm afraid the connection is failing us, John. So we've lost some part of what you've said. Yeah,
okay, can I continue?
Yeah, let's maybe.
Shall I continue?
Okay, we can hear you, but we cannot see you actually. So I don't know if something. Yeah, if something can be done about it. For now, actually, I had next question to John, but in the meantime, while we're having technical problems with connection, I'll ask the same question to Andrés. This is a question from a member of our audience. Was it morally difficult to work with the characters of your film? And have you changed your impression about them after you started filming?
I don't, morally it wasn't difficult it was scary, but not in a moral sense. It was more of, you're going into a territory where authorities have no control, and the ones who have control are criminals. So the fear was definitely there every single time you went in. Obviously, after a while, the fear stopped being in terms of like what these prisoners might do to me individually, and it became more of like because as you see in the prison, the government started going into these prisons with the military and taking back control from some of them. So it was always like a ticking time bomb type of feeling. So when I was in there, it was like, all right, is this going to be the moment? Am I going to be filming here when the government comes in and starts shooting everybody inside, and then the war breaks out between the prisoners and the government? But in terms of filming subjects, it became very close to many of them who are now my friends. The group of hip hop artists, they call themselves Free Convict. Some of them work for our production company in Venezuela. Like we've helped a lot of them, or at least this core group that we developed while we were in prison. They became my friends, and the perspective on them did change. Some of them became closer, but it's not like I went in with, and I think that's what allowed us to go in for so long, is that I didn't have any moral judgments before or any preconceptions, even though I had been kidnapped in 2011 by prisoners, outside of the prison system, but I was kidnapped in 2011, and the guys, while I was kidnapped, told me that they were inmates that had escaped from El Rodeo prison, which was one of the first prisons I visited. But in terms of me like having any judgment or any moral attitude towards them, I think no. I just saw them as people who had committed mistakes along the way, and I was very interested. There were only like 2 or 3 people that I met that I was really scared of, that I saw as like, all right, I can't talk to this person, because there's very little when you see someone and you talk to them, you can see, throughout the years, you start understanding what's inside them. Is there good? But there were 2 or 3 people that I met that I felt that were so bad and so evil that I was like, all right, I can't talk to this person. There was some like a gut feeling, like I prefer to stay away from them. And I don't know, it was just like an internal defense mechanism more than anything.
Mm-hmm. And at least in former Soviet space, penitentiary system is also called quite often correctional institutions, like in many other countries. In your film, we can see prisons being taken over by criminals, and as you've mentioned before, crimes are committed inside prisons as well as outside prisons, and people who committed crimes outside get in and they continue to do that same thing indoors. Do you think penitentiary, not only in Venezuela, but in its current form, at least in the Western type shape, does it have anything to do with correction? Because some people from your film, actually, they served their time, they came out, and they changed their lives, but it looks like they've changed it due to religious motives in the first place. Is it correcting anyone, really, or is it just punishing?
I think it's more, this is, obviously, if you look at the history of, human interaction with those who commit crimes, we come from a system of like, the first legal system, the Hammurabi Code, that, was an eye for an eye. If you stole, you got your hand cut off. So it was from corporeal punishment, from punishing the body. And then it started, the modern system is more of punishment of the mind, like they were talking about in the other films, like writing letters, writing correspondence, having that physical contact, depriving a person or limiting a person from having that type of experience, I think is part of the modern concept of punishment. There's still people, this is not my perspective, but there's still people in the legal system and in public opinion that think, criminals should be punished, and it's a personal perspective of, okay, how do you correct someone? Do you correct them by, constant positive reinforcement, or do some people need, negative punishment to correct themselves? It's a question that I don't necessarily have the answer to, but I do see that in Venezuela, it's not, the government, when Chavez came and all of the politics behind it was to try and be less repressive with the prisoner population, and they actually let a lot of people out, and people who weren't corrected, and so crime obviously went up. If you don't correct the individuals that go in, then they're going to spend 5-6 years inside, networking in a criminal space with other people. What you're developing is stronger criminal ties, giving kids access to knowledge of criminal networks that they didn't used to have. So if you don't have a system in place that actually gives them tools or gives them mechanisms through which they can reinsert themselves into society, whether in the labor force or have actual opportunities, then it's just going to continue to be the same cycle. Because you see a lot of these people go into the prison system because of circumstantial crimes. A lot of them is in small narcotics trafficking, which is the economic escape that some of these kids find in the slums. You have there's very, actually evil people, that it's a small percentage of the population. So when you don't have economic opportunities, then it's obvious that criminal activities are going to rise in terms of finding a way to get a job or finding a way to get, your material things. And I think if you go into a prison system in which because the punishment in these prisons, in Venezuelan prisons, is administered by the own inmates. So like if you steal, like they say in the prison, if you steal from another prisoner, you get shot in the hands. So they're reverting back to a Hammurabi type of code system within their own state. And it seems to work for them. It's like I would leave my phone in the studio and nobody would, you're surrounded by society convicted thieves, but they wouldn't steal within the prison because they knew that the punishment would be getting shot in the hands or even shot in the leg or on the stomach. So that type of repressive system within their own set of rules cause people to be more afraid. I don't think it's a good system, but I think it's the way that humans have to have a way to interact with each other. And I think when you leave them to their own devices, these types of rules are the ones that initially at the first stages of society, before you understand that it's more about providing opportunities, about providing employment, about providing education, that really can cause criminality to listen in society.
Mm-hmm. And my colleagues tell me that we have John Webster online, film director for the film Eye to Eye. We can hear him, but we cannot see him. John, I don't know if you can hear us.
Yeah, I can hear you, but I don't know what happened. It was 4G when I started, and now it's 3G, but I hope...
well, this is the downside of online festival, I hope we'll improve it, but it doesn't mean that I hope that lockdown will last forever. We have a question specifically to you, John, from a member of our audience. How did you get this idea to make this film, and to follow, were there any unpredictable situations during the filming?
Well, I have I've experience from two projects working in prison. One was a documentary theater production, also with people serving life sentences for murder. So I had some experience with that. And then within that same prison, they started this restorative justice program. And that's how I got to meet the people. And also, my experiences are very similar to Andrés in the sense that
in prisons, very much keeping your word is the most important thing. To that you say whatever it is that you want to do, that you speak truthfully about it, and also are open about what you want to do, and also keep what you promised. So over the period of about 3 years, I got the trust both of the prison and also of the inmates. What, of course, the other part of the question was, were there any surprising moments? Well, the actual meeting the meeting between the murderer and the family member was, nobody knew really what was going to happen there. And we also, for filming it, we also wanted to make sure that our presence of the cameras didn't influence their meeting. So we built some walls made out of cloth so that the cameras could be behind them. I mean, everybody knew that we were there, but we didn't want them to see us while they were talking to each other. Mm-hmm. And so from the first moment that they step in, a mother whose daughter was murdered 13 years ago, this is the first time that she sees the murderer after 13 years.
Yeah. That's a striking scene in the film. I mean, for myself personally, it definitely was. Just to repeat more or less the same question I've asked Andrés about, restorative justice is not a part of usual penitentiary landscape we're used to in our countries, at least not in former Soviet Union. And it amends it. Is there any chance these other things will be able at a certain moment to replace the existing prison system all over the globe? And is it correcting people really, or is it rather just punishing them?
Well, one of the most striking experiences as part of the project was that this same restorative justice method, they bring the family members who have already recovered and been through this process, they bring them actually to the prisons to talk with the prisoners about their experiences. And I've followed 3 or 4 of these, and every time it's remarkable the difference in the prisoners afterwards. Because for the first time in years, or perhaps even ever, they are brought in a situation where they can see the other point of view. And because a prison, as Andrés was saying, like a prison society, it's very closed. It has its own rules, extreme in Venezuela, it seems, but even in a place like Finland, it has its own rules and an own society. And I think people, because we are so adaptable, people adapt to that way of life. And they don't perhaps reflect so much on what they've done. I mean, now I'm talking about the prisoners who are in there for violent crime and for murder, and it has a big influence on them if they are brought to a situation where they have to think about the other side. Mm-hmm. And I think that is wonderful correction. I mean, that's one step towards correcting and making people reflect more and perhaps want also to change their lives once they come out.
Thank you. We have a question to Alice and Charlotte from our audience member. You've mentioned that most of people in this association who write letters to prisoners are women. And the question is, do you think this writing letters to prisoners is another sort of free reproductive work women do in our society, like women usually do? Like, are women just used to do these things because they're women, or what is the reason for this gender disbalance in writing letters to prisoners?
Alice, do you want to answer?
Just, yeah, maybe, like, I wouldn't, I mean, they were not, as like the character we have in our movie, who has reflected on it, like, she has been doing that for 25 years now. They kind of feel like for her it's like kind of her duty as a citizen to write to prisoners. But at the same time, she enjoys writing. She enjoys having like those new conversations. She also, I really think she enjoys what we mentioned earlier, the fact that you have to be careful about what you say to the other. So it's like a very subtle relationship that you create. So yes, it is kind of a free reproductive work that is done mostly by women, especially when you can have like NGOs or parts of civil servants who do this job to maintain contact with the prisoners. But at the same time, you never do it because you're obliged to, like, it doesn't exist. It's not a core for most of the women who do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but actually, it was we conclude while discussing with our character and other women who answer to that for us, yes, it does represent some own duties women could feel towards society, and yeah, I will answer yes to that question.
Okay, and we don't have much time left, but of course there are more questions than we have minutes. But probably just to conclude with current situation. As it's been already mentioned, under COVID-19 pandemic, some countries released or are going to release certain number of prisoners, and it changed rules of access to prisons. But there is another side to it, not to sound insensitive. It looks like more people will be set free, but more people feel themselves being like in some sort of semi-prison situation. In countries like Ukraine, where lockdown is in effect, and people are persuaded, not obliged, but more or less obliged to stay indoors. They cannot really go outside without very specific reason. Another side of it, more and more countries use this pandemic as a pretext to increase observation upon their citizens. Even the capital city of Kiev, one of the first things which have been done during pandemic, the special street cameras were purchased in big number, which can not only recognize the faces, but also to measure temperature of the passers-by. When someone happens to be locked up in prison, I just remember my own personal experiences when I was for a short period of time in prison, long time ago, for political protest. I could not really understand on a very tangible level what is happening, how comes I cannot walk outside physically, outside of the cell, and just go. And how it happens, how is it possible that I can be observed at any moment in time. It was really strange feeling I never experienced before, but it seems that now more and more people feel it without going to prison. It looks like we have more prison-like situations outside of the prison. Also, we have examples of solidarity and people helping each other and be more kind to each other under these very difficult times. So, what do you think after this pandemic comes to an end, and it hopefully will we find ourselves in more prison-like situation as a society, as societies, or will it rather strengthen these patterns of solidarity and mutual aid one can find in any prison around the world, and more of human understanding between so different people? What are your prospects for the end of pandemic? for the discipline, punishment, and solidarity and freedom?
Well, I could just say that it's always good to experience something to understand it better, and maybe that could bring people to think about the fact of being imprisoned. But is this sufficient? I don't know. It will need people to remember and to think about it after the experience time, and that's always a big challenge to remember things when you're not living it anymore. So I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that with every situation there's good and bad that comes out of it. I think this obviously has given people a lot of time to reflect, especially in terms of our interconnectedness as a world. How we're in Ukraine, France, Finland, Venezuela, the United States, and we're all under the same circumstances, which means I think this is kind of like a universe test of how humans need to understand that we're all in this together, we're in the same globe, and there are issues that affect us as a species and as part of a living organism that is Earth. And I think this is a call to that. This is our trying to understand. And like any situation, there are people who are going to come out of this better and people who are going to come out of this worse. But I think the universe has a way of balancing these things. I do see in Venezuela the threat of, and in many places, the threat of totalitarian states having more power and observing more population. But I think it's like a pendulum. The more totalitarian states, and there's always going to be people that fight that. And as long as we have the human spirit that looks for freedom and fights for freedom, if you have one person that fights, you still have it. So I think that's one thing to look forward to or to understand, is that people are still going to, if fascism tries to arise again, and if totalitarian leaderships try to arise, there will always be people there who fight against it. So I think that's a universal thing. I think it has arisen in history and it'll go back again. It's kind of like a cycle, I think.
Thank you, Andres. John, do you have any look upon that and any opinion? What will, any hopes or maybe worries, what will come out of it?
Well, I many good in many countries that this will be taken as an opportunity to lock down society even more and restrict people's basic human rights. But I think certainly on a larger scale, perhaps that we will learn that to solve big problems, we all need to work together.
And it looks
realize
like,
more.
Yeah, it looks like we are having again technical issues coming back to us with the connection, I'm afraid. But yeah, the fears about installing more totalitarian regimes are quite widespread. Alice, you are the only one who didn't say anything. What would you say?
I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, but there was one thing that afraids me, is that I see, like, I myself go out on the street, I rarely wear a mask, and some of people are frightened by me because I don't have a mask, and this is something I hear also, that even if the virus is contained first, and that we are allowed to go out, people won't go and be together because we tend to have become afraid by each other. So I'm just a bit worried about that people will stay in quarantine by their own choice and stay alone much more longer than what is imposed to us. But at the same time, as we said, I think it's like one of those times we rarely live where we feel together in many parts of the world. So that is always a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. This feature of the lockdown time was already mentioned when we had our soup with directors, the second one, and there was this comment that lockdown destroys solidarity because people start to be afraid of each other. But also it provokes constructing networks of solidarity, and this is probably something we should not expect, but we should try to participate in. And this is what DocuDays VA Human Rights Film Festival strives to achieve, to help people join into preserving and expanding these networks of solidarity and freedom, fight for freedom. As Andrés mentioned, even if there is authoritarian regime, there is always someone who fights against it and fights for freedom, and we have a lot of films about people who fight for freedom and solidarity at our festival. Just to remind you, films still can be watched online, except those which have limited numbers of views, until the 10th of May, while festival goes on until the 3rd. This is probably, it's coming to an end, our soup with directors. Thank you very much, Andrés, John, Alice, and Charlotte. I'm sorry that we had technical issues with communication with John, but yeah, this is downside of online festival. Please stay tuned to our next events, which can be heard and seen online, and also take part in the Living Library, which works as all previous years, also online. And don't forget to vote for films when you watch them, if you are located in Ukraine, and leave your comments in video log system at docuspace.org. Thank you and have a nice and safe day. Bye.